Hey, good morning, Harbor family. Great to be here. I'm one of those that's from Texas. I always love when Josh does host because I never know what's going to be said. But I'm always excited. And I'm one of those from Texas, 15 years born and raised. I didn't realize that Coloradans hate Texans until I moved here and I'm sitting in my sophomore math class. In front of me is my now wife. I've never met her. And I say the word y'all with a slight Texan accent. And who would have turned around except my future wife with the dirtiest look as she asked me where I was from. She gets mad at me every once in a while for throwing her under the bus, but I feel like that one's worthy. So if you're from Texas this morning, welcome home. If you're not from Texas and it's your first time, welcome home. We're glad that you're here watching online with us, watching in person. We're wrapping up our series called Refocus today as we've been examining 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and all that it has to say on what love is. My name's Ryan. I'm the associate pastor here at Harbor, and I'm excited to wrap this series up. We're going to read 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7 here in just a second. But today we're going to talk about the nature of love, and specifically its limitless nature. There's no end to it. And when I was a kid, I didn't understand this concept. I always would ask my parents, I had 3 sisters, I would always ask my parents which one of the kids that they loved the most. And even to this day, all of my sisters will admit I'm the firstborn, that it's me, I'm the only boy, I'm the special one. Anyone else think they're their parents' favorite? Anyone know they're their parents' favorite? Let's go. We've got a few of those. I can remember even into my 20s and even in my earlier 30s, it was a question for me on the limitless, endless nature of love. I come from a broken home, and one of the things I was implicitly taught in my experiences was that love had an end date. Love had a timestamp, right? When you found a better opportunity, a better situation, it was okay to leave your commitments and to find somebody else to love. And so I sort of had this question, and this will sound really shallow, but when I was in my mid-20s getting ready to marry my lovely, beautiful wife, I questioned whether I could love her more than I did then as we aged and got older and weren't as attractive as maybe the world standards has for us, right? We idolize youth. And so this was a question for me. I'd watched people walk away. And one of the things that I know now, and we've all experienced if you've been married, is that you love your spouse more, right? A decade later, 2 decades later, 3 decades later, than you could have ever even imagined when you got married. It was the same thing for me when I had kids. I told God I had a girl first. So my daughter's 8 years old. And when we were pregnant with our second, I told the Lord, I said, I can't handle 2 girls because I can't love a girl as much as I love the one I already have. Like, I don't have enough love in my heart for another human being. So it's going to be a boy. And I can't imagine loving that boy as much as I love this little princess that you've given me. But for anyone who has kids, right, you know that love expands. I could have 5, 6, 7 kids, although my wife would probably not enjoy childbirth and pregnancy that many times. My sister has 7 kids, believe it or not. And I've watched her, man. She loves every single one of those kids just as much as she loves the first one. Love is limitless. It's limitless. And as we read this passage today, I'm going to read all of the verses that we've been looking at. And it starts in verse 4. I want you to pay attention to the limitless nature of love. It's what this message is about today. And it says this in the first verse. There's no qualifications to anything that's said here, either positively or negatively. Right? Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. And this last verse is what we're going to talk about today. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Joel's been reading out of, our lead pastor's been reading out of the New International Version, the NIV, where this is a different translation. And if you look at all the different versions of the Bible that we can read today, most of them translate it this way, which is why I read it in this passage, this version, right? Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Such a beautiful statement, right? There's no qualifications to it. And one of the things we have to be careful of as we read it, I understand why they translated it this way. If you look at the original language, the Greek language that it was written in, there are these 2 words for every phrase. The first is essentially always, or the second is always, and the first are these 4 Greek verbs that end in ei. So if you were to read this in its original language, there was a rhythmic sound to it. right? It was these four repetitive phrases, and this version captures that really well when it says love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. But when we read this, we capture the limitless nature of love, but one of the things that we can unwittingly think is that love doesn't set boundaries. That if we're going to love, we have to endure anything that people throw our way. And we have to sort of be hopelessly optimistic, almost gullible in the way that we interact with and treat other people. We become sort of doormats if we're not careful when we read this passage. And love is not an excuse or a reason for us to experience abuse and mistreatment without end. Love is not something that points us towards hopeful optimism, where we never see who people truly are, where we never discipline, correct, or set boundaries. And I believe that that's true in this passage. I believe it shows us what it looks like to love limitlessly and set healthy boundaries. Limits and boundaries are not the same thing. And love has no limits, but love does set boundaries. And the reason we have to have boundaries in our life is because everything besides love is limited, right? Our time is limited. I'd love to be friends with every single person, well, almost every single person in the world, but it's just not possible. I don't have enough time for it, right? Our resources are limited. As a church, we'd love to help out every person that comes our way. But the reality is that we don't have limitless funds. We have a limit to what we can do. We also have physical and emotional limitations. There's only so much abuse we can take psychologically, physically, emotionally before we break down, right? Sometimes when we try to help other people, we end up unwittingly becoming like them. And as I reach, right, I'm 36 now, as I start to get older, I'm learning to appreciate my limitations in life and to set better boundaries. And really, I'm a guy, so I'll beat my head up against the wall until I break myself. But I have women in my life who help me understand that I'm not superhuman. We went on a winter retreat last weekend with our students, and we went skiing on Saturday. It was phenomenal, beautiful weather. It was so fun. It's the first time I've been skiing since I moved back because of COVID, and just because it's insanely expensive. Does anybody else just not go skiing or snowboarding because you can't afford it? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? How many skiers do I have in the room? I'm a skier. Anybody? Let's go. Snowboarders? We got a few, right? I feel like you can tell a lot about a person by what they eat, whether they ski or snowboard. But we went, and what was interesting about this time before we went out on the mountain, this has never happened to me before. I'm on my way, my wife's out of town. I get a phone call from my wife and my mother, and they both I think they colluded. So they both called me, and they had this conversation with me. My philosophy with skiing, or really any physical sport, is I want to push myself, and I think this is a guy thing, I want to push myself as far as I can to the limits of what I can do, and then some, without horrifically hurting myself. Is there anybody else that's the same way? Yeah, and this has worked really well for me in my late teens and 20s. But my wife and my mom both called me on the same day, and they said, Ryan, I want you to be careful when you ski tomorrow. You're not as young as you used to be. Man, what a terrible phrase to tell a guy. I mean, come on, man. And so I was really careful all day, but there was this jump right under the lift at the end of the day that was just calling my name all day. I was really good, man. The last run of the day, I was really good. But the lift closed, there was nobody on the lift, and if you're like me, I don't like to ski under the lift. Is anybody the same way? Because I don't want people to see when I screw up. There's just something that's shameful about people laughing at you as they're 20 feet above your head. And so I took this jump. I had nailed everything all day. I told my wife, I was like, I still got it, man. 20 years of skiing. I haven't skied in a couple years. I was so proud of myself. And then I take this jump. I look down as I'm about to land, and I realized that what was underneath my feet was not snow. Somehow in the midst of all the powder that was around, there were rocks and sticks right where I was about to land. And I had two thoughts as I was inches, I was feet off the ground, all right? As I was feet off the ground, I had two thoughts. First of all, this is really gonna hurt. And my second thought was, my wife is going to kill me. But God is so gracious. God is so gracious. I feel like he does this with me. I think he does this with all guys. He gives us like a shot across the bow. Have you noticed this? Like, okay, it was like the one time I got up, nothing hurt. It was amazing. My skis still worked. And I think this is my one warning as I get older, that I'm not who I used to be. And I'd love to tell you I'm going to do better next time. But how many of you know, like, guys, we just have to get hurt before we learn our lesson? I'd love to tell you, sir, I'm going to listen to you, but I don't think it's going to happen. But this is reality, right? We all have limits, and we set boundaries in place in our lives so that we don't horrifically hurt ourselves. But the reality is we also set boundaries in our lives. We discipline and correct other people so that we can help them. Sometimes the only way we grow is when other people help us to recognize our mistakes, our flaws, our limitations. And I think we do a pretty good job of this in most areas of our lives. But the one area we struggle with to set boundaries in is relationships, right? How many of you have seen spouses that are sort of codependent, and one spouse is maybe verbally abusive or physically abusive and maybe has some addictions and hard, awful tendencies, and rather than stepping in, sometimes we enable and excuse their behavior, right? Because it's easier to put up with something or to pretend like something doesn't exist than it is to engage with it, to set boundaries, to correct. We fear sometimes how people will react when we call something out, even if it's in love. We see this with kids, right? Entitled teenagers and young adults are often the product of parents who haven't set healthy boundaries, who haven't disciplined and corrected, who've allowed their kids to have the benefits of something without the discipline and the correction that often goes with these types of things. And we're all guilty of it, right? And we also see this with friendships. One of the interesting things about being with young people on a mountain where they don't have cell service is that they have a hard time not being completely connected to their friends, setting boundaries. We got home from the ski resort, and one of the kids, this is a true story, his friends were all mad at him because he'd had intermittent service to Snapchat, he'd read their messages, and he'd left his friends on read. That means, I'm not cool enough to really know what that means, other than it just means he read their messages and didn't respond. And the true story, all of his friends were mad at him because he hadn't responded for like 2 hours. Isn't that insane? But this is the world we live in, right? We live with dysfunctional people. We live with needy people. We live with people who have issues. We all have issues. And love is limitless, but love sets healthy boundaries. And I think we often struggle with this for the reasons that I've just mentioned. Because we don't want to hurt people's feelings. Because we don't want to have hard conversations. But I think there's also another sort of sinister side to this. The reason that we don't set healthy boundaries, I think is often because when a gap exists in a relationship, when there's separation between us and somebody else, which is what happens when we discipline and correct, what can happen is three things. We write people off, we assume the worst, and we condemn others. We write people off, we assume the worst, and we condemn others. And that is completely unloving, right? All three of those things are the opposite of love. We limit the limitless nature of love when we do these things. And I experienced this firsthand personally. My parents got divorced when I was 7. I said at the beginning, I come from a broken home. And when my parents got divorced, it was due to some infidelity, some workaholism. I have great relationships with both of my parents today, wonderful people. But they got divorced when I was a kid because of those two things. And I experienced a lot of heartbreak and disappointment as a child when I dealt with the reality of some of my dad's behavior. And to protect myself and also for his good, I had to set healthy boundaries in our relationships. But what happened as this gap, this separation existed in our relationship was that I began to do these three things. Without him around, based on his past behavior, I just began to write him off. I assumed that nothing would ever change, that he would always be who he had been, that he was always going to be this philanderer, this workaholic who would never be a part of my life. I'm thankful that a lot of those things aren't true today. But this is what I assumed and experienced when I was a kid. I began to assume the worst. When he wasn't around, I would just think that he was off doing things that he shouldn't have been doing, that he was more concerned with work than he was with my life. And the worst part of it was talking to some of the people that knew me when I was 10, 11, 12, 13, I actually began to condemn him. So I began to be physically angry, and I'm not an angry person most of the time, unless I'm hangry. But I would just literally, fist balled. I was very much an angry person, and I wished ill things on him. I hated him. Some of the experiences that I had. This is not love. This is not love. We can love others and set healthy boundaries. And we can experience, I believe even as we set healthy boundaries, we can love people more in that process than we did at the beginning. And this book is proof of this, what we're talking about here. Because throughout the book, as Paul, the author of this letter, talks about the limitless nature of love, he also tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, bad company corrupts good morals. And in other words, we should draw lines in the sand with toxic people. He also in 1 Corinthians 5 deals with someone who's living dysfunctionally, and he talks about how we should hold people accountable for sin and abuse. We should hold people accountable for dysfunction. We shouldn't ignore it. And here's what this passage points us to. It points us to this reality. The path to healthy boundaries is forged through the limitless law of love. If we're gonna set healthy boundaries, if we're gonna discipline well as parents, if we're gonna correct friends and coworkers and family members when they are off, we will do it out of and through love. It's not a separate process. And if we try to do either one of these things without the other, we will miss out on what God has for us. And I wanna share with you a different translation. I love the ESV that I shared at the beginning. But I believe that this translation captures what the original author Paul intended. And it says this, 1 Corinthians 13:7 this way, and this is what we're gonna talk about, just a couple of ways that we can forge healthy boundaries through the limitless nature of love. It says this, there is nothing love cannot face. Nothing that love cannot face. There is no limit to its faith, its hope, and its endurance. And the first point I see in here is that love confronts and covers injustice. Love confronts and covers injustice. We have this tendency to either avoid the issue or abandon the person. I'll say it one more time. When we deal with abuse, dysfunction, and sin, we do it in one of two ways. We either avoid the issue or we abandon the person. What we're shown here is that we are called to both confront and to cover injustice. That's what it means to bear all things. What this passage, this phrase says in the original language is interesting. So the Greek word that's used, the verb that's used here is actually the cognate verb for a noun. So it's like laugh and laughs, right? Laugh is a verb and laugh is a noun. Sleep and sleeps are both a noun and a verb. The noun and verb that's used in this passage is roof. So what it literally says, what they would have heard is that love roofs always. It's kind of a weird phrase, right? Love roofs always. But I think about the significance of that term. What does a roof do, right? A roof covers, it bears the weight of something, it protects what's going on inside the home. So when we think about a relationship, we have this realization that there's sort of this attitude, this posture, that I can cover anything that you're going through. We can get through this together. I will come alongside you and walk with you. And I will engage with you on your level. I'm not gonna go and share this with other people. I'm not gonna gossip about this to anyone outside of this relationship. I'm not gonna go and try to shame you or condemn you by tearing you apart from the outside. No, we're gonna handle this together. But there's also this idea of confrontation when you live under the same roof. When I was in college, I thought I was the big man on campus because I was 18 and living in my parents' home. I could come and go as I pleased, right? This is a typical young adult attitude. I could do whatever I wanted. I could eat whatever food I wanted. I could watch whatever TV show I wanted. I didn't have to be home, right? And my parents had to sit me down and explain to me that they paid the bills, right? They owned the house. Anybody ever dealt with this with young adults? Yes, let's go, right? And that if I was going to live under their roof, right, I was gonna follow their rules. It was my parents' way or the highway, sort of. And I believe James captures this attitude, this idea of confrontation and covering so well. In James chapter 5, at the very end of his book, when he talks about bearing all things, he says, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. In the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, it says that love covers a multitude of sins. And he's directly connecting this idea of confrontation with covering sin. You can't separate the two. If you're gonna love someone, you have to confront and cover. This is what Paul's getting at here. And throughout the rest of that verse, when it says, there is nothing love cannot face, there's no limit to its faith, its hope, and its endurance, we're given some principles for how to do this. And the second one that goes along with this is that love believes the best. Love believes the best. Man, it is so easy to see people's flaws, isn't it? I mean, we all try to hide them and cover them and act like we have it all together. As one of our staff members, Julie, says that we all have our poop in a group, right? But the reality is that we don't have our poop. I don't know why we're talking about poop today, Josh. What's the deal, man? Man, I blame Josh for that comment, right? We don't have our poop in a group. That's just the reality. And it is so easy to see people's flaws. It is so easy to condemn them. It is so easy to subtly poke at people and to see everything that they do wrong. But that's not the posture of love. That's not the attitude of love. Even as we set boundaries and discipline and correct, we believe the best in people. We see the good. And there's no story in the life of Jesus that signifies this better than the time he came ashore. It's right before Jesus is going to feed a bunch of hangry people who are gonna riot if he doesn't give them something to eat. The next day, if you continue reading in the passage, these same people who he feeds are gonna walk away when he stops giving them what they want. Every one of them is gonna abandon Jesus in a matter of 24 hours. A couple years later, this crowd is gonna crucify him. And when Jesus comes ashore, he could have looked out at the crowd and he could have said, man, these people are awful. What a bunch of evil sinners. He could have walked away and not fed them, not walked alongside of them. But in verse 34 of chapter 6 in Mark, it says this, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. He saw the good in people. He wasn't out looking for the worst in everyone he encountered. What a revolutionary mindset change. Man, in so many of my relationships, whether it's with my wife or my kids or coworkers, I have a tendency to see the negative. But my contentment in life and my ability to live successfully and also the reaction of other people is often just based on my perception of them and my appreciation for who they are and what they're going through. To recognize that maybe I'm not seeing everything and maybe I should react with compassion for what they go through as I help them become who God has called them to be. So love confronts and covers injustice. It does it by believing the best. And love also sees the possibilities. Again, there is no limit to its faith or its hope. So love hopes for the best in a person. Love sees what's possible. It sees who a person can become. Jesus did this with one of his disciples, Peter, when he called him. So first day Jesus met this guy named Peter. We know him as Peter, but his name was Simon when Jesus called him. And so Jesus meets this guy, Simon. He walks up to him and he asks him to be his disciple, right? To follow him, to become a fisher of men. And he looks at this guy he's just met. So imagine this. He looks at him and he says, yeah, I know your name's Simon, but I'm gonna call you Cephas. So I don't really like your name. We're gonna call you something else. And here's what's awkward about this. So Cephas is the name we now know as Peter. But what's awkward about this situation is that the term Cephas just means rock. So it wasn't a person's name at this point in time. It wasn't like he was calling him some other name that was common for people. He went up to Peter and he just said, yeah, I know your name's Simon, but I'm gonna call you Rock from now on. I mean, that's weird, right? He just picked some inanimate object as this guy's name. Sort of awkward, but why did he do that? Jesus saw what was possible for this guy. He was impetuous, man. He would do dumb things. He would say dumb things. He would promise things. Like he told Jesus he was never gonna deny him, and then he denied him 3 times. And Jesus saw who this man was gonna be, a rock, a pillar of the church, and he changed his name. I love that. I don't do that in my life oftentimes. I was talking to a family member recently about some people that I loved. And I learned something, that these people far away from Jesus, people that I've had a hard time with over my life, I found out that they used to go to church, used to know the Lord, and they had walked away from their faith. And I only saw who they were right now. I didn't see who they were or could become. And as I thought more about that, I realized that, man, I got a lot of friends and family members that don't know Jesus. And so often, I don't believe the possibilities. I don't take a second to imagine who they'd be if God transformed their life. Who they'd be if the boundaries, again, the correction were responded to with humility and they turned to the Lord. Man, I think this is one of the most helpful exercises that we can engage in as we love people well and set boundaries. So love confronts and covers injustice. It does it by believing the best in people, by seeing the possibilities of who someone can become. And it does it by working towards redemption. There's no limit to its endurance. That term means, at essence, that I'm going to stand by you. I'm gonna walk with you. There's nothing you can do to push me away. You may choose to walk away for a while. You may choose to go do your own thing. There may be a severing in the relationship, but the second you turn, the second you reach out, the second you respond, I'm gonna be right there. This is the attitude of love. This is the limitless nature of love. It can grow when there's separation, to the extent that when someone reaches out in humility, when someone turns towards us, this is what God does with us, that we respond with joy and celebration. Love works towards redemption. And in Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells the story of what it's like when someone turns to the Father, when someone humbles themselves and repents. And he tells it through the story of a prodigal son, a son who decided that he didn't want to live in his father's house anymore. He was going to separate himself. He knew he couldn't live the lifestyle he wanted to live with his dad, and so he had to leave the home, right? There's a separation, there's boundaries there. And so he went off and did his own thing. He spent his entire inheritance, wasted it all on foolish things. And he eventually was so broke, he was poor, homeless, destitute, he was eating with pigs. I can't imagine something nastier than that, eating with pigs. And he eventually wisens up and decides to go home. And he's afar off from his father on his way home. And in verse 20 of Luke 15, it says this: "And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him." And the key sentence there for me is while he was a long way off. You see, the father encapsulates all these things, right? He didn't ignore the issue. He confronted and covered injustice. His son had to leave, but he was always seeking out for the good in his son. He never stopped believing that he would come back. He viewed the possibilities. And when his son just turned even slightly, he didn't even give him a chance to explain himself. He brought him into the home. What a wonderful attitude for us to have. What a beautiful posture that we see in the Father. He confronts, again, covers injustice. He believes and sees what's possible, and he embraces redemption. And all these principles are great as the band comes back up, as we prepare for communion and a few songs that we will close with here in a few minutes. It's great to have these principles, right? But this is easier said than done. It's a lot easier to say this than do this, or we would all be doing it. It's hard to set boundaries, to discipline and correct, and to do so in such a way where love grows. The picture I get here of the Father is that his love for his son grew even while he was absent. And I think the only way we'll do this in a healthy way is if we allow the limitless nature of love that's presented in this passage, the idea of boundaries and relationship, to point us towards the cross. That's what this entire passage, verses 4-7, push us towards. Love is patient and kind. Who's been patient with us? In spite of everything that we do to walk away and rebel from the Father, it's Jesus, right? Who confronts and covers injustice? Jesus didn't avoid the issue of our sinful nature, our dysfunction, our disobedience. He came and lived the life that we couldn't live. He covered injustice. He died the death that we deserve, so that when we approach God by faith in the name of Jesus, we're made right. His blood covers our sin. Jesus sees the best in you and I. He doesn't see the worst. It was for the joy that was set before him that he endured the cross. He sees what's possible. He sees you and I as perfect. Can you believe it? You and I is perfect, man. I know every single flaw and failure and evil thought I've had. But when God looks at me in the name of his son, Jesus, he sees the best. And love works towards redemption. That's why Christ came to the earth and lived the life that he lived and died the death that we deserve, so that we could be redeemed, so that we could be made right. And how dare us hold things against people and write people off and assume the worst and get angry and use boundaries and consequences and discipline vengefully, because that's not the way God works for us. He doesn't shame or condemn us when we come to him. We can work towards redemption with everyone that we come into contact with. We can experience the limitless nature of love even as separation exists in relationships. God is so good to us. And I hope that this series, as we've talked about healthy relationships, as we've refocused on the essence of love, I hope that there's been a tangible difference in your attitude, your posture towards others, your view of God's love for you, and your interactions with those you love and care about, your family, your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors. And I want to leave you today with 3 questions. As we prepare to take communion, after this song after I pray and walk off the stage, you'll be free to go and grab the cup and the cracker to remember Jesus' body that was given for you, for the punishment of our disobedience, the blood that was shed, his life that was taken as a ransom for ours, so that, again, when we believe in him, we can be made right. You're free to take that by yourself or with your family and friends as we sing a song called Reckless Love. But in closing, 3 questions. Would you ponder this week where you might need to set some healthy boundaries with those you love and care about? Again, family members, friends, coworkers, people that you interact with. And how could you confront and cover injustice? Maybe the reflection point for you is you haven't covered, you've gossiped instead of handling it in a healthy way. Maybe you've just avoided the issue because it's too hard to deal with, or maybe you've abandoned the person and just thought that they were beyond redemption. Would you ponder this week, and would you pay attention? Do you, those 2 questions in the middle, do you truly believe the best in other people? And do you think about the possibilities for those who are far from Christ, who they could be if God got a hold of them? And lastly, would you prayerfully pursue? And what would it look like to exhibit the limitless nature of love with other people, to work towards redemption in your relationships? I'm gonna pray and close, and again, as I walk off stage, you're free to grab those as we sing Reckless Love. Would you join me and stand as we close in prayer? Father, we love you and we thank you today for your word. We thank you that your love for us is limitless. Lord, that your love grows over time. It is, Lord, there's not a cap to it. And Lord, I thank you that you have chased after us, that you are patient and kind with us, that you have faced everything that you needed to so that we can be made right with you by the gift of your and sacrifice of your son, Jesus, God. I pray that you would help us to live into that, to embody that in the way that we interact with other people. I pray that this church, each one of us individually, would be marked by healthy relationships. Lord, that we would see what's possible, that we would believe the best, and that we would always be working towards redemption, even as we deal with the difficult and hard things of life. God, be honored and glorified in all that we do today and throughout this week. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.